But this is going to be a very interesting conversation. Everybody's read about the fact that Prashant Bhushan, who is a lawyer activist, was held guilty of contempt of court for his tweets that criticized the Chief Justice of India. He was then, after a very closely followed court case, was eventually fined 1 rupee. But there was some time in between before that sentencing hearing when people who were close to Prashant Bhushan and many other around the country were worried that maybe he would go to jail. But Prashant Bhushan dug his heels in and refused to apologize. And eventually now is 1 rupee poorer. Joining me for this conversation is Mr. Prashant Bhushan. Mr. Bhushan, thank you for joining us and good evening. We understand that you've decided to pay the fine, but I want to have a slightly wider, longer conversation with you because I know that there are many young people who've only heard about you now and who want to understand you better. So for the benefit of our audience, I want to bring up the fact that you've been now a public interest lawyer for many decades. But for now, everybody calls you anti-Modi. Do you see yourself as anti-Modi?
Well, right now I am anti-Modi because I feel that Mr. Modi represents the greatest threat, not just to our democracy, not just to our constitution, not just to the rights of people, but he represents the greatest threat to our civilization. We have never seen this kind of an evil regime in this country since 1947. Even the emergency regime was not as evil and not as threatening to our democracy, civilization, values, everything. Because this is one regime that has systematically dismantled and suborned all the regulatory institutions which were created by the Constitution to protect our democracy. It has systematically indulged in communal propaganda, in diversionary propaganda, in systematically trying to assault the capacity of people to do critical thinking, to be able to distinguish between truth and falsehood, to erode their capacity for their scientific temper. It's an assault on everything that we value, which we have never seen before in the last 75 years. So that is why I am anti-Modi. I was anti-Congress. I wrote a book about the Bofors case called Bofors, the Selling of a Nation. I fought so many cases against the Congress. I saw the emergency. My father fought the case against Mrs. Gandhi during the emergency. He fought the habeas corpus case. We have seen an assault on democracy during the emergency. We have seen a very corrupt Congress government when it was in power, but we never saw this kind of assault on our civilization itself that we are seeing today.
In fact, Mr. Bhushan, I don't know, just to call out the list again for our audience, the kind of cases Mr. Bhushan has taken up in the past, when going up against Reliance, PepsiCo, the Narmada Dam, the Bhopal gas tragedy for the victims, the UPA government in the coal scam and the 2G scam, the you criticized the Aam Aadmi Party that you were part of and then you left, the BJP government. And of course, you've been very vehemently vocal about corruption in government and judiciary, this is not your first contempt case. This is your second very prominent contempt case. Could you tell us what happened in the first one and, how that played out?
Yeah, you see, so that was occasioned by an interview that I had given to Tehelka about the judiciary in general. Where one of the questions was, do you think that there's a lot of corruption in the judiciary? So I said, yes, there is a lot. In fact, in my view, about half of the last 16, 17 chief justices were corrupt. And on that, Mr. Harish Salve, who posed as the amicus curiae, he filed a contempt petition against me, even though he had a conflict of interest in that matter, but he filed a contempt petition on which the court then converted it into a suo motu petition and issued contempt notice to me. So I said that, look, this is my perception about the extent of corruption at the highest places in the judiciary. And I can tell you what is this perception based upon. I have been involved in this campaign for judicial accountability for so long. Uh, I have prepared impeachment motions against various judges, etc. Uh, so therefore, it's a perception based on my experience. Now, I can show you the bona fides of my perception, but they still persisted in persisting with that contempt case, and therefore I was forced to file a more detailed affidavit, giving instances of at least 7 retired chief justices who, in my view, had been corrupt and whose corruption I detailed in those affidavits with documentary evidence. I pointed out that by corruption, I didn't mean financial corruption alone. Corruption in the Prevention of Corruption Act, in the UN Convention Against Corruption, in legal dictionaries has a much wider connotation. It means any improper behavior by a public officer. That's corruption, that is being influenced by extraneous considerations. So it was in that sense that I had referred to it. Now that case then went into cold storage since 2012, and it was suddenly resurrected along with this fresh contempt notice and placed before that same bench headed by Justice Arun Mishra. Now, of course, there are several serious issues of law which have been framed and which will probably need to be referred to a larger constitution bench before that particular case can be decided.
Yes. So a lot of my viewers have written in with questions asking if things are worse now with corruption within the Supreme Court than they were when you had first made that accusation.
No, I wouldn't say that they are necessarily worse so far as corruption is concerned. They are probably similar to what they were earlier. But what's probably worse is that the independence of the judiciary seems to have come down. And that often happens when there is a very strong government. It happened during the emergency also. And we are seeing it again now, that most of the Supreme Court judges don't seem to be willing to stand up to this executive, and they don't want to annoy the executive. That seems to be the case.
On a matter of principle and theory, Mr. Bhushan, when a former Supreme Court judge or a Chief Justice is immediately almost appointed to Rajya Sabha, is there a problem there? Should that be of concern to citizens?
Yes, of course, because post-retirement jobs and these kind of posts like governorships, membership of parliament, appointment to various commissions in which the government plays a role. This is seen as a very serious lure by which the independence of the judges gets affected, because then they tend to pass orders in favor of the government at least closer to their retirement. In fact, Arun Jaitley had said in Parliament in 2013 that post-retirement jobs certainly influence pre-retirement judgments. And he said that judges should be barred from getting post-retirement jobs. I don't go to that extent. I feel that judges can be given post-retirement jobs, but the government should play no role in that. That decision should be made by a Judicial Appointments Commission, which should be a body completely independent of the government.
You also talked about, and this is a word that gets bandied about a lot now, nepotism. And you've mentioned in the past that there's nepotism in the judicial appointments of judges as well. How would that work? Isn't this now an independent body making the decisions?
Yeah, but even today the collegium is making the decisions for judicial appointments. Of course, this is interfering even in that by not appointing inconvenient judges, not appointing independent judges. They just sit on the recommendations for years altogether until the judiciary agrees to appoint, or the collegium agrees to appoint people that the government wants. But more than that, you see, there is no transparency even in the collegium system of selection. And there is no system. If you ask a Chief Justice, how do you select judges? He'll say, well, we look at competence and we look at integrity. You ask them, how do you look at these? They'll say, we look at their judgments. But if you are appointing somebody to the High Court, a lawyer to the High Court as a judge, he has no judgments. Then What about integrity? They'll say we look at the IB report. Now the IB report is notoriously unreliable. That's no basis for judging somebody's integrity. And why do you not look at other things? Judicial temperament, adherence to constitutional values. So that is why nepotism flourishes. You have not laid down any system. It's all totally ad hoc and pick and choose. And there's no transparency, so nepotism flourishes. Justice Arun Mishra's own brother has recently been appointed to the High Court. If you look at his social media accounts, etc., you'll see that he doesn't adhere to constitutional values, that he is communal, and therefore he should never have been appointed. But unfortunately, because of this nepotism, he has been appointed.
Mr. Bhushan, we have obviously the government, but and that's the executive, like you rightly said. There's the legislature, there's the judiciary, and then there's the media, which is the fourth pillar. And enough has been said about the way the police is conducting itself right now in various states and central agencies. And enough has been said about the media as well. Where are the checks and balances for our democracy then?
Yes, unfortunately, that is the most frightening thing that has happened, that all the checks and balances have been eroded. The judiciary, its independence has been compromised. The media has been completely taken over or become what is known as a lapdog media, the mainstream media, and they are involved in communal propaganda, raising diversionary issues, raising absolutely, I mean, can you imagine more than 2 months that prime time is devoted to Prashant Singh Rajput and his death? It's absolutely flabbergasting, and that these media anchors of big media organizations like Times now have the gall to say that when somebody raises the issue of a 24% decline in GDP, he says, don't waste our time on irrelevant issues. We are discussing Sushant Singh Rajput's death and Riya Chakrabarti. It's absolutely, I mean, flabbergasting as to what has happened. So that's what is very alarming, that today all the checks and balances which were there to protect to protect democracy, to protect fundamental rights, etc., they seem to have been mostly eroded. And that is why we need common citizens and people to come together and stand up against this.
But Mr. Bhushan, a lot of common citizens now are afraid of because of what happened to you. Because there was this time when everyone was holding their breath saying, is Prashant Bhushan going to go to jail? And immediately people turned around and said, hey, you know what? I don't want to be in his shoes. Now citizens are afraid because of the way this played out. What is your response?
In fact, this was the intention probably, to scare and make people fearful of commenting against the judiciary and indeed against the government also. But in fact, the opposite has happened. This case became a kind of cause celebre to celebrate the freedom of speech. A lot of people stood up and were emboldened to say, all right, if you want to punish him, punish me as well. I am saying the same thing, or even prepared to say stronger things about the judiciary. So therefore, it had the opposite effect. And one other good effect that it had was that it brought the spotlight on the role and the function of the judiciary in the last 6 years as to what it has done or not done to protect democracy. And I think that's a positive outcome of this case, though that was not what was intended.
What gives you hope? Are you going to, first of all, keep fighting, and as you have done in your entire career? And what gives you hope right now that the fighting will change things? Why do you keep doing it?
I do it because I have to, meaning that firstly, you see, if I see some injustice or some serious injustice or some serious issue of public interest around me, and if I feel that I can do something to redress that, I try and do. Secondly, you see, I am in a very privileged position. I come from a very privileged position in society. I come from a very privileged background because of my education, etc. It has given me many privileges. because of my standing in the court has also given me many privileges. And therefore I say that, look, if I don't speak up and stand up, who else will? How can you expect other people to stand up if I don't, with all my privileges, if I don't speak up and uh, stand up? So therefore, I feel that I am not cynical or hopeless about change taking place. I feel that there is a large section of the youth in this country
Mm.
who are concerned and bothered about what is happening. And they are alarmed at what is happening. They need to be shown some direction as to what they can do to help things, to help the situation to correct itself. So I'm not at all cynical, or I don't feel hopeless at all.
What is your advice to young people right now? How how do they fight if you believe that fighting is what should be done?
So firstly, they need to keep their eyes and their minds open to what is happening around them. They need to observe what is happening around them. They need to see what kind of injustices are taking place. They need to be sensitive to other people, to other communities, to other people. When people ask me what is the object of education, I say that there are only two objects. One is to inculcate or to improve the capacity of critical thinking and reasoning. And the second is to make people more sensitive towards other people, other communities,
Mm.
and to other beings and to the environment in general. Now, if you have these two capacities developed, you will become a good human being and you will become a capable human being. You'll be able to do anything. So the first thing is to observe and try and understand what is happening in society. And the second thing is to at least speak out against injustices that you see around you. And then the third thing is that if you have the capacity to do something more, this much at least everybody can do. Thereafter, if you have the capacity to do something more, then try and organize yourself and run campaigns on major issues of public interest. There are so many problems, such as the economy, employment, education, health, uh, communalism, so many serious problems which need to be addressed. Judicial reforms, they need to be addressed. And therefore, whoever has that capacity to do a little more needs to see which is the issue that interests him and organize and get involved in a campaign around that.
You've also given advice to young lawyers in the past, and I know that there are many students coming out of law school right now, many smaller practices that are struggling at this point. And there's a sense of, maybe if not hopelessness, a sense of helplessness, that we're too small to actually change anything. Do you have advice for younger lawyers?
Yes, I do. Uh, my advice to younger lawyers would be ki don't treat this profession only as an instrument for making a living and making money. You are supposed to be the warriors of justice. So the first thing is to try and see how you can correct some injustice around you and how you can help to correct some injustice around you. Of course, it is important to also make a living,
Mm.
but not at the cost of promoting injustices. And if you have the time and the capacity, then uh, interest yourself also in public interest issues and take up public interest causes if you can, to the extent that you can. So that would be, and also to be involved in this issue of judicial reforms, because the lawyers, since they understand the system, they can be at the cutting edge. Of course, the issue of judicial reforms needs to be taken up by the people who are the main stakeholders in a functioning system of justice, because they need the courts and the judiciary for justice. But the lawyers, because they understand the system, they can be at the cutting edge of this campaign.
I also want to ask you a slightly personal question about your education, if I may, with your
Yes, of
permission.
course.
I read that you started first studying engineering at IIT Madras. You dropped out after a semester. Then you studied philosophy, BSc at Allahabad. Then you got a full scholarship to study philosophy at Princeton, and you dropped out of that as well, and then decided to become a lawyer. So, my two questions are, and this is again for young people today who are graduating from college and not really sure of what they want to grow up to be. What was that journey? Why did that happen? And has it made you a different lawyer because you've studied different things and you've tried out different things?
Yeah, so I had a very convoluted academic career. So as you said, I first went to IIT thinking that anybody who's interested in science should go to IIT. There I realized that I was not really interested in engineering and that I really wanted to study physics. So I came back, but by that time the intermediate exam was just 2 months away. They didn't allow me to take physics and chemistry because I hadn't done the practicals. So I took mathematics, economics, and logic. For the first time, I studied economics. I bought the 8th edition at that time of Samuelson and read it from cover to cover. And I found that even economics was interesting. At the same time, I was introduced to Bertrand Russell and I read several of his books. And I found that even philosophy was interesting. So instead of repeating the year with physics, chemistry, etc., I decided to do a BA with philosophy, economics, and politics, political science. But in the course of that, I gradually lost interest in economics and my interest in philosophy and physics, which I was studying on my own, increased, and I wanted to do an MA in philosophy, and there are philosophy of science, etc. But people during that time, this Mrs. Gandhi's case also took place while I was in my BA. I attended the hearings in Allahabad as well as in the Supreme Court. I attended the hearings of the habeas corpus case, the Kesavanand Bharati review, and I found that even law was interesting. So though I was more interested in philosophy and philosophy of physics in particular, um, I decided to formally enroll in law because people told me that, look, what is that? Look at the state of philosophy departments in the universities. What will you do? So I enrolled as a law student, but informally I continued to study philosophy and physics on my own. By the time I was completing my law, my interest in philosophy and physics had increased considerably. So I decided to apply for a PhD at Princeton University in philosophy of science, and they gave me a scholarship there. So my LLB final year exams had been delayed, so I left that and went off to do a PhD to Princeton. Now, by this time, I had become what is known among philosophers as a logical positivist. And I found at Princeton that the philosophy that was still being done was they had now gone back to metaphysics in a different guise called philosophy of language, etc., which I found was meaningless and just playing intellectual games. And for the kind of work that I wanted to do, I realized that I would need to study a lot more physics. I would need to spend another 4 years studying physics. At that point, I was not prepared to do that. So then I came back and completed my LLB final exam, then got enrolled in law, and then gradually got involved in public interest issues, first environmental issues, then civil liberties issues, then corruption issues, then social justice issues, etc. Uh, However, you see, this kind of academic journey, which was, as I said, a very convoluted academic journey, a lot of people feel that, look, you wasted so much time studying this, that, and the other. Ultimately, you came back to law. What was the use of that? Nothing that you study, this is an advice to young people. If you study something seriously with your heart, nothing gets wasted. One of the great benefits of my studying philosophy seriously is that I got into the habit of thinking through problems from first principles. You try and go right to the root and to the fundamentals. Even among lawyers, it is said that there are two kinds of lawyers. those who are first principle lawyers and those who are case law lawyers. The case law lawyers, if they are given a legal problem, they immediately start thinking of which case has dealt with this problem. And therefore, they go and read those judgments and
Yes.
arrive at the answer like that. My father and some other people like Ram Jethmalani, etc., were first principle lawyers. So when confronted with a legal problem, they would try and go to the root of that and say, well, what does basic principles of justice, equity, and fairness say in this? If there is this law, what was the basis for making this law? What was the objective behind this law? And try and understand the meaning of that law from the basis and the objective of that law, rather than quickly going to some judgment and looking at case law. So one of the benefits of my philosophical background and training has been that it has made me think through problems from first principles, from fundamentals. And sometimes you see in that process, you are still reinventing the wheel, but sometimes the wheel that you reinvent becomes a better wheel than what was invented earlier. So therefore, it's a very useful practice. And as I said, see, no education which is seriously done is ever wasted. All this education that I've had, including economics, studying economics seriously for a year or year and a half, that comes in handy in understanding all these issues. My background in physics and science. So for example, the case about nuclear energy, it helps me to
Yes.
understand. So it's all useful.
Uh, we obviously know that we are fighting for our fundamental rights, but we also have fundamental duties at this point. If you were to leave this young audience with an idea or a thought, something to push them in a direction, to give them hope and to give them purpose, what would that be?
So I would tell them that, look, we are fortunate to be living in a country like India, which is a unique country with enormous diversity. We have enormous cultural, linguistic, religious, geographical diversity, biodiversity, and all that diversity is our treasure. We need to understand that India is, in many ways, the most fortunate country to live in. But today, we are being told exactly the opposite, as if religious diversity is an evil, and so on. And we need to build on that. And we were fortunate to have people, such fantastic people who framed a fantastic constitution. And we need to protect that constitution and build on that. There are, of course, many things which are going wrong, which need to be corrected. But it is the young people who need to be in the forefront of correcting them, because the young people are the main stakeholders for the future of our society. They are the people who have their lives before them. They are the people who have the maximum energy, maximum new ideas, and therefore they have to be at the forefront of reclaiming our republic.
Should they be prepared to go to jail for it as well, Mr. Bhushan?
Yes, absolutely. You see, once we adopt this attitude, I was asked also, were you not fearful of going to jail? So my father has always told me that you look the devil in the eye, which means that you look at the worst possibility. Suppose they send you to jail for 6 months, what will happen? After all, my grandparents went to jail for more than a year during the independence movement. My father went to jail for a week. So many of these fine Bhima Koregaon activists are in jail. What will happen? I will, nothing, heavens are not going to fall. And if everybody adopts that attitude, how many people will they put in jail? How many? It's not possible. Then this whole thing crumbles. This assault, they are trying to scare us by the fear of putting you in jail. But once you, during the independence movement, also Gandhi told people that, look, you have to lose that fear. Once you lose that fear, you are free. And the people who are trying to suppress you, they will thereafter lose heart and walk away.
Mr. Bhushan, one last question, if I may. At the question of losing fear, on one hand, we can say that what if happens if you go to jail for 6 months, or in the case of the Bhima Koregaon activists, you're talking about more than a year. But it's going to be on the 5th of September, 3 years since Gauri Lankesh, the journalist, was gunned down in her own home. Sometimes the consequences are worse than just 6 months in jail.
Yes, they can be. Occasionally, they can be worse. And but sometimes that fear gets exaggerated. So I would like people, young people especially, to know that those fears are exaggerated fears. And therefore, they should certainly have a realistic assessment of what might be the consequences, etc. But not these outlandish fears that I will be killed or everybody will be killed and so on. That's not something that is likely to happen.
All right, Mr. Bhushan, thank you so much for spending time with us and answering these questions, and I wish you very good luck.
Thank you, Faye. It's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure, sir. Thank you.